I lived in a haunted house for 5 years, and it was nothing like in the movies. I want to start by pointing out a very obvious fact. There's a huge difference between real-life hauntings and the ones you see on the big screen. I don't mean just because the movie world is populated solely by good-looking people and riddled with every cliché trope in the book, but because movies like to tie things up in a neat little bow at the end. They might not always have good endings, but they always give you a reason for what's going on. A rotting corpse hidden under the floorboards, an ancient burial ground discovered in the backyard, a long history of brutal murders in the house, a demonic heirloom of some sort. The list could go on. That's not the case in the real world. At least, it wasn't the case in my experience. My story starts a few weeks before I moved into a new house and ends the day I moved out. Because the truth is, sometimes there are no answers to why a house is the way it is. I lived in what I believe to be a haunted house for 5 years, and these are my experiences. It started in 2000 when my parents sat my sister and me down to announce we were moving again. As an army brat, I was used to this conversation. We were told when and where we were moving, and then shown a photo of the house. As an army brat of 2 retired army parents, however, I was a little confused as to why we suddenly had to move in the middle of the school year, but I didn't question it. As weird as it might seem to people who've lived in the same house all their lives, to my family, moving was the status quo. As was the case with every move, there was a part of me that hoped that this time would be the last and that we'd finally settle down into a permanent home. I didn't get off the hype train until I saw the house in person, and boy, was I quick to jump off. I hurled myself right out the window. For one thing, it was a rental property, which, in and of itself, meant it was temporary. But more importantly, the place looked like crap. I remember there being newspaper spread out on the floor in the middle of the kitchen, right under a yellowing low-hanging light fixture dripping water. My bedroom was painted black, and the previous tenant had scribbled poems about suicide on the walls in multicolored crayons. Though I now find the thought of some emo kid doodling with wax crayons rather amusing, I was royally creeped out at the time. The stairs were creaky, the ceiling looked waterlogged, and the whole house was as dusty as an attic. I couldn't believe this was the place my parents had picked. It wasn't as though we were poor and desperate. We were your average middle-class family. We were moving out of a lovely semi-detached home with our swimming pool to this den of dirt and grime. And if all that wasn't bad enough, I found out that the previous tenants had just up and left. They'd withheld rent for months, neglected the upkeep, then, one day, just disappeared, taking all their stuff with them. The owner was never able to track them down. So yeah, we were off to a great start. The next time I saw the house was the day we moved in, and thankfully, it looked much better. The owner had changed the leaky light fixture, cleaned up the dirt, and applied a fresh coat of white paint throughout the house. The only room that still made me uncomfortable was the laundry room at the foot of the basement stairs. I'd get this creepy crawly feeling whenever I'd go in. You know, like when you feel someone breathing down your neck, but turn around and no one's there. It was bad enough that I'd usually dash past the door whenever I went downstairs. And if I had to go inside, I'd use a leg to prop open the door just in case. So yeah, aside from the laundry room, the house was initially fairly normal. Sure, I'd hear a few strange noises here and there, but they were just the sounds of the house settling and water running through its pipes. It always takes a bit of time to adjust to a new home, but after a while, the cracking and snapping in the walls fade to background noise. They're just sounds you notice only when you're not familiar with a place. A flushing toilet, for instance, would wake me up in the middle of the night for the first couple of weeks, but after that, I could sleep through it easily. I think it's just survival instinct, our animal brains trying to keep us alert in a new environment when it's not sure where danger might lurk. If I had to pinpoint the exact moment when things changed, I'd say it happened one night a couple of months after we moved in and long after I'd adapted to the sounds of the new house. Now, one thing most people don't know about me is that I'm about as good at falling asleep as I am at playing the ukulele, and I can't play the ukulele. I go from wide awake, to wide awake, to wide awake, to slightly drowsy, to suddenly asleep. The process takes over an hour every night, no matter how exhausted I am or how late I go to bed. That night, like every other school night, I went to bed at 10 expecting to fall asleep around 11. I wasn't sure exactly how long I'd been in bed, but I was still awake when I heard a sound unlike the ones my brain had grown accustomed to ignoring, a knock at my bedroom door. Along with that knock came a man's voice. "Are you asleep?" he asked. I turned over and replied, "No." He continued, "Let me in." "Dad?" I asked, eyes still closed. "Can I come in?" the voice asked. It didn't sound like my dad, but who else could it have been? "Okay," I replied. I heard quiet footsteps towards me and then felt something putting weight on the bed, kind of like a parent's hand as they leaned in to give you a goodnight kiss. That's when I realized I hadn't heard the door opening. My eyes shot open and I saw someone standing over me. I can still remember him clearly. He had pitch black hair, a long crooked nose, an aging face, thick eyebrows, and a scornful scowl. I could see him so clearly, as though my room had been lit up by the flash of lightning, even though there hadn't been so much as a cloud in the sky that night. The final detail I noticed, before my eyes shot momentarily towards my lamp, was the black raincoat he wore. By the time I flicked the light on and looked back, he was gone, and I was covered in sweat. My eyes wandered to the clock. 10 past 10. If it had been a dream, if I had been asleep when it happened, then it had been the quickest I had ever fallen asleep. That night marked the first of many strange occurrences. It was a hot summer day, and I was hiding away in the basement, browsing the web. My first year of high school was over, and I had committed to spending my summer vacation doing absolutely nothing. It was around 3:45 p.m. when I heard the front door opening. Just in time, I thought. It was my dad getting home from work. He was a morning person and worked an earlier shift to avoid rush hour traffic. I headed up the stairs to say hello, as I usually did. "Hey, Dad," I called out as I ran up the stairs. He didn't reply. I turned the corner and headed down the hallway leading to the entrance, but when I got there, it was empty. The door was unlocked, so I knew he had come home. "Dad?" I shouted. This is where it gets a little complicated, so I drew this little floor plan to try and help you follow along. If you can't click the link, the first floor looped around in an open rectangle with the stairs going up at the center of it. There was this mirror between the front door and the garage door, and from that mirror, you could see the hallway where I'd just come from, as well as a sliver of the stairs up to the second floor. After calling for my dad another time, I caught a glimpse of his silhouette in the mirror. He was standing behind me in the hallway, which isn't impossible to achieve. He would only have had to circle the living room, through the dining room and kitchen, and then into the hallway where I stood. The only odd thing was how quietly he'd managed it. I once again turned around and smiled. "Hey, how was your day?" In a split second, I realized the figure wasn't in the hallway, but rather up the stairs. Just an optical illusion, I figured. But an optical illusion didn't explain how Dad had avoided the familiar screech produced by the third step. The quintessential sound of someone going upstairs. That's when I realized something weird was going on. "Dad?" I asked again, but I couldn't help but lower my voice. No answer. The dark silhouette walked out of sight and towards my parents' room. Every single cell in my body was telling me to get out. All the warning bells were blaring danger, danger, but I didn't listen. I mean, I saw a man in the house, I heard the front door, and it was exactly the time my dad usually came home. Aside from him ignoring my welcome, there was no reason for me to think something weird was happening, yet my body was telling me otherwise. I ran up the stairs to the second floor and peeked into my parents' room, where I saw the silhouette of a hand pulling away from their dresser and towards their walk-in closet. I'm honestly not sure why the hand was what did it for me, but it was the push I needed for my brain to catch up to whatever danger signals my body was sending out. I just remember going from thinking dad to realizing burglar. I mean, it's such a weird thing, right? Just a hand. It's not like I'd be able to recognize my dad's hand if you showed it to me in a lineup of random hand photos. I'd probably think you were a little weird for having a bunch of photos of hands on you to try the experiment in the first place, but that's not the point. The point is, I didn't feel safe anymore. I backed away quickly into my room and reached for one of my many decorative swords. Decorative, but sharp. I unsheathed the weapon and closed my door slowly, careful not to make too much noise. It was a fight or flight situation, and by gosh, I was going to fight. It seems absurd to me now that my reaction wasn't to call 911, but then again, this happened before every kid and their pooch had a cell phone, and the only landline upstairs was in my parents' room. It's not like I could have waltzed in there and made the call without getting caught. So instead, I stood in my room, hands trembling as I waited and listened. I could hear his footsteps up and down the hall, followed by a slightly muffled voice. There were pauses in between, as though the person was waiting for a reply, but not a reply from me. A reply from someone on the phone, I supposed. I strained my ears, but couldn't for the life of me make out what he was saying. Who was he talking to? Did he know where I was? I shouldn't have called out so many times. He knew he wasn't alone in the house. Would he come after me? My heart pounded in my chest and thumped in my ears. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, but as stupid as I wasn't stupid enough to move. It was safer to stay where I was and wait. My real dad would be home soon, I figured. But then, everything went quiet. I slowly approached my bedroom door and listened carefully, but the voice was gone and the footsteps had stopped. It was as though the house was empty again. Just to be sure, I waited longer. And by gosh, it felt like forever. At least, in teenage time, it did. Unsure of what to do, I opened the door a crack and looked out into the hall. If I'd been in a horror movie, that would have been the moment when something would have suddenly jumped in front of the door, but nothing happened. I came out of my hiding spot and slowly went from room to room, opening every door and looking for whoever had broken in. Again, this was a very stupid thing to do and I should have run out and called the cops, but we all know teenagers don't make the best life decisions, and I wasn't immune to teenage bravado. Luckily for me and my continued existence in the universe, all the rooms were empty. Confused and rattled, I sat at my computer and kept my sword on my lap until the door opened 20 minutes later and my dad called my name. I ran upstairs with my sword, and he gave me that weird look dads give you when they catch you doing something not quite your age. Hell if I know what he thought I was doing with it. Probably thought I was playing make-believe or something. Long story short, he'd gotten caught in traffic. I told him about the burglar, and we went from room to room checking each one. There was nothing out of the ordinary, and nothing had been taken. And honestly, to this day, I'm not sure whether that was a relief or somehow more frightening. I know what I saw that day. I know someone was in the house, because, after all, if my dad hadn't unlocked the front door, then who had? My house wasn't the only place where weird things happened. There was something eerie about the whole neighborhood. When my friends came over, we'd test out that teenage bravado I was telling you about earlier by taking nighttime walks in the woods close to my house. My friends would take turns clinging to my arms and yelping whenever something made a sound. They said they felt safe around me. I don't know if it was because I just had that secure air to me, or because I told them about the weird things I'd experienced and survived in my house. One night, my friend and I were walking back to my place after skating at the park. We used this shortcut behind an outdoor mall, a dimly lit path that connected the main road to the residential area. Even though it looked kind of creepy, it was by no means unsafe. Barely 25 meters long, the path was hardly the kind of place a psycho killer would go to stalk his prey. As we started walking down the snowy path, I stopped for a second and looked up at the sky. It was pitch black, with neither a single cloud nor the flicker of a star anywhere in sight. For some reason, it struck me as really odd. I felt that tingling sensation at the back of my spine I'd get whenever I walked by the laundry room. "Weird, it's too dark," I said. Almost as soon as the words left my mouth, there came a gust of wind so strong it dislodged a massive icicle hanging from a tree about 20 meters ahead of us. And when I say massive, I mean it. It was a couple of feet long and sharp as a knife. You know how they've got warnings for falling ice around buildings nowadays because that shit is dangerous? Well, imagine this icicle being 3 times bigger than the ones you're supposed to watch out for. Now, imagine it was out for goddamn blood like some shitty B-list movie. See, this thing didn't gracefully drop to the ground. It defied gravity and made a beeline for my friend and me. She shrieked and grabbed me so tight she nearly knocked the wind out of me. We were both frozen as this thing, easily capable of impaling us through our winter coats, came hurling towards us so quickly we couldn't have run even if we wanted to. Then, just as it arrived within 2 feet of us, about the distance of my bubble, it banked sharply to the right and stabbed into the ground like an arrow. I swear, I'm not making this up. My friend still talks about it to this day. 1 second the icicle was coming at us, the next, it did an abrupt 90 degrees turn. Hell, if I didn't know any better, I could have sworn I saw it deflecting off of something. I have a photographic memory, and whenever I think back to that night, I can sort of see something there in front of us, like the sheen of a window or something. Then, for a brief moment as we were trying to catch our breath, I saw the man in a black coat standing under the tree. Just standing and staring at us. I felt my stomach turn and looked at my friend. She was still looking at the icicle in the snow. By the time I looked at the tree again, the guy was gone. Sometimes, weird things would happen to the house itself. While I was the only one in my family to see a man in a black coat hanging around, everyone could see the things appearing on the walls. More specifically, one day just out of the blue, I noticed something near the light switch at the foot of the basement stairs. Yes, close to the laundry room, but on the opposite wall. It looked like a bloody handprint, except drawn in red crayon. I'm not saying my sister and I were perfect little angels, but we were very well behaved, and neither of us would have done something like this. Partially because we respected people's property, and partially because our mom would have made us clean it up no matter how long it took to scrub it off. I remember a detailed conversation about drawing on the walls and how we could do it if we wanted to, but she didn't know any easy tips to get crayons off the wall and wouldn't help us clean if we embraced our inner artist. And mark my words, you will clean it, she had said back then, with the threatening sternness of a mother. That's how I knew my sister hadn't drawn the handprint. That's why I dragged her downstairs to show her. This wasn't here before, was it? I asked. I mean, it might have been there all along and I'd never noticed it. My sister ran a hand over it curiously. I remember how much bigger the handprint was compared to her hand. The fingers were thicker and longer, as though belonging to a fully grown man. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. No, it wasn't, she said. She looked as creeped out by the mark as I was, but I still had to ask, did you draw it? No, she replied. Wasn't your room covered in crayons before we moved in? I nodded. Yeah. You can still see the color when the paint gets scratched. She rubbed her hand against the handprint again. That's probably what happened here. The paint wore off or something. Yeah. That would have been the end of it if we hadn't then gone to our computers and noticed a dent in the wall. A dent that looked like a goddamn skull. A fist-sized skull, but a skull nonetheless. We saw it at the same time and gave each other a conspiratorial look. Maybe that dent had always been there. Maybe we only noticed it because we were a little on edge about the eerie handprint. That's creepy, right? She asked. Yup. This was the first time anyone else in my family had seen proof of the bizarre things that happened in that house. As for my mom, she didn't seem all that bothered by either the hand or the dent. She didn't even make us wash it up. And now, we come back around to the topic of teenage bravado. When you're a teenager in a group of peers, you'll eventually get to the point where you stupidly want to test your bravery by going somewhere creepy and see who cracks first. My friends and I had already conquered the woods, so naturally, we had to up the ante. This is where my laundry room came in. See, I wasn't the only person freaked out by the laundry room. Without ever mentioning it to my friends, every single one of them had told me they felt something weird about it. I mean, yeah, they knew I'd seen creepy shit around the house, but I'd never told them how the laundry room in particular made me uneasy. Unlike the rest of the house, it was unfinished. It had a hard cement floor instead of carpet, an incomplete ceiling, and exposed wall studs with pink insulation ripe and ready to be picked like cotton candy. Maybe those factors contributed to the overall creep factor of the room, I don't know. At some point, someone decided it'd be a good idea to lock ourselves in the laundry room, turn off the lights, and see what would happen, and that's exactly what we did because we were dumb teenagers looking for a cheap thrill. We packed ourselves in the room, all 5 of us. Honestly, I'm not even sure how we all fit, that's how small the room was. We huddled together, and I gave everyone a final warning before I shut the door and turned off the lights. We were quiet at first, but within about a minute, I felt my friend's grip tighten around my arm. Then, all of a sudden, she shouted, "Something just touched my leg." There were a few laughs, but no one admitted to grabbing her. The laughter subsided, and I felt a sort of strange tension in the room. Maybe, one by one, we all realized we hadn't been the ones to touch her. "I want out," said another friend. That was enough for me. My instincts were already going haywire. They had been from the moment I'd shut the door. I swatted my arm toward the light switch, but felt a void in its place. I pawed around blindly, expecting to feel the wall or the insulation, but my hand didn't connect with anything. Now, even though I avoided the laundry room, I'd been in there enough times to know exactly where that light switch was. Even if I didn't, there wasn't enough, room in that room for me not to touch the wall when I swung my arm. "Something's got my leg," shrieked my friend, a note of panic in her voice. "It's not me," said another. "I'm not touching anyone," answered a third. A fourth voice replied with, "I'm not even near her." I was the only other person there, and I knew I hadn't grabbed her. I tried for the doorknob, but just like the light switch, I couldn't find it. It felt as though the room had taken on completely different proportions. I don't know any other way to describe it. You know that feeling when you miss a step or you think there's one step more than there is? It was kind of like that. It made no sense. The room was small and narrow. Even if I missed the mark, I should have hit the wall. And if I was facing the wrong side somehow, then my hand would have connected with the washer, but it didn't. Then, finally, just as I heard one of them shriek, I felt the cold metal doorknob and swung the door open. We ran out of the laundry room so fast we could have outrun Sonic. My friend, the one who said something had grabbed her, pointed to the laundry room door. "Did you see him?" she screamed. "See who?" asked one of the guys. When the door opened, a man was standing in the corner of the room, she shrieked. I nervously popped my head into the laundry room, turned on the light, and looked inside. The room was empty. We spent the rest of the evening hiding out in the living room. My friends never went into the laundry room again after that night. The last incident that happened wasn't quite as spectacular, but it was just as puzzling as everything else. I was about to start my final year of high school when my parents announced we were moving again. I was pretty upset about it. For all its faults and creepiness, the house had become my home. We'd been living there for 5 years. 5 whole years. The longest I'd ever stayed in a single place, and now we were leaving. With just a few months left on the lease, this happened. It was almost noon, and my sister and I were off school for the summer. I was reheating a meal in the microwave when my sister came down the stairs and looked at me with a frazzled expression on her face. "I have a weird question. Would you mind counting my library books?" she asked. I checked the microwave. It still had a few minutes to go. Sure. Why?" I replied as I followed her towards the stairs. "I need to return them today, so I counted to make sure I had all of them, and I did, but then I turned around to get my bag, and when I turned back around, one of the books was missing. I counted to make sure, and sure enough, I was one short." "Did it fall under your bed?" I asked. I checked. It wasn't there. I recounted just to make sure, and suddenly I had all my books back, she explained. "Okay?" She continued, but then I triple-checked because when I counted, I didn't see the book that was missing, and I'm short by one. "It's not in the pile. Can you just count and tell me if I have 21? When we got to her room, she looked surprised. She pointed to a book at the top of her pile. "There it is." I turned on my heels. "Guess my work here is done. Can you just count?" "Just in case," she asked. With a shrug, I knelt and counted all the books one by one. 21, you've got them all." "Phew. Thanks," she answered. I headed back downstairs just as the microwave stopped at midnight. But weirdly enough, it started up again, marking 3 minutes on its timer. I figured it was some kind of electrical glitch and stopped it manually so I could eat. For the record, that was the only time the microwave ever did that. After lunch, my sister and I headed to the basement to play video games together. As I turned the corner, I saw something gleaming on the floor, sofa, and table. "What's that?" I asked. I don't know why, but my first thought was ice. As I moved closer, however, I realized it was glass. My sister and I stood there for a second and looked at the mess. "Where did that come from?" she asked. That's when we noticed the light fixture on the ceiling. The circular light shade was missing. "How the hell?" I whispered. From what I could gather, the light shade had broken somehow, but not in a way that could explain the mess. See, because there were shards on the table and sofa, I figured it must have exploded while on the ceiling and showered down. The problem was if it had broken in the air, then the metal ring screwing it in place would have been up there, and would probably have had a few pieces of glass still hanging from it. The ring, however, was on the floor, which meant the light fixture had fallen straight down in the large gap between the sofa and the table. But then, how had glass gotten on the table and sofa? Hell, how hadn't we heard the thick glass lampshade break? My sister and I both thought it was really weird, but we cleaned up the mess and explained the situation to our parents as best we could. Mom wasn't mad. She told us there must have been an air bubble in the glass that caused it to explode. That didn't explain the ring being on the floor, but hey, at least she wasn't blaming us for the mess. That was the last thing I experienced in that house. I think it was a sort of sick goodbye message from the entity I'd seen so many times. We moved about a month or two later. In the years since, I've often wondered about the house and if its next tenants experienced similar things. I know it changed hands quite a few times. People move in and out every couple of years, or so I've been told by a neighbor I've stayed in touch with. I've also wondered about the family that lived there before us. Wondered if they'd left the house because they, too, had seen the man in the black coat, or if their departure was unrelated. I'll probably never know why the hell that house was haunted. It was barely 25 years old, hardly old enough for something to have happened to it without there being any information about it in the news. All I know is that something was seriously messed up with it. I live alone now in a nice and safe condo, and I haven't experienced anything weird since my family moved out of that house. Don't visit the pop-up haunted house. Do you see that? I drive by here all the time and never noticed that house before. My friend Mel was pointing at a gray building, the size of a barn, with no windows and only one big door. On top of the door was a sign written in red letters. Harry's Horror House. We were driving by it on our way to a corn maze one town over. There was a small parking space in front of it, so I slowly came to a stop so we could take a closer look at it. Weird. Must be some kind of pop-up, my other friend Jake said from the back seat. Well, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mel started grinning. She was the biggest fan of haunted houses you'll ever meet. She'd been dragging me and Jake to multiple ones every year around Halloween, ever since we'd gotten too old for trick-or-treating. Except for last year when Mel's sister disappeared from home. All she left was a short goodbye letter. Susie was a year older than us. She graduated a few months before disappearing. Their parents weren't the caring kind, and they never got along with Susie. She had graduated and was old enough, so it wasn't too odd that she wanted to leave. However, it was odd that she completely broke off contact with her sister as well. Mel hadn't been the same since. So it was nice to see that this haunted house could spark some excitement in her. We immediately agreed to come back at night to check it out. You sure you're up for it, Rob? Jake joked with a big grin on his face. I've never been the biggest fan of haunted houses. I absolutely cannot stand jump scares, and I don't see why anyone would enjoy the feeling of being surprised by some messed up creature. I also never trusted the actors in those houses. Who says a serial killer isn't hiding underneath them? Yeah. I'm fine, I lied. Jake took the first steps towards the big door and I reluctantly followed. Mel squeezed my hand. "Don't worry, you'll be fine," she whispered. As we opened the door, I expected some person to greet us and sell us tickets, but all we saw was a small room with a desk. The walls were gray and naked. There was no paint, no signs, or anything. The entire room that hardly fit the three of us had nothing but that tiny desk and a door right next to it. On the desk, we found a piece of paper and a little cash box. "Welcome to Harry's Horror House. You will see that this wonderful home is not quite that scary, but rather welcoming and warm. You will enjoy your time here, however long you might stay. All you need to do is follow the signs that lead you through it. And we might see you at the end. Entrance fee optional, but preferred in metal." "Optional?" Jake asked. "And what do they mean by metal? Do we leave anything?" I shrugged. "Probably following some kind of theme, I guess, but I only have my card." At that point, I silently hoped that we would just leave again. "Well, it says optional, right?" Jake said. "I got it." Guys, Mel went through her wallet and got out a couple of coins. "That's metal, right?" They loudly fell into the metallic box, and suddenly the door automatically opened. I swallowed. Jake grinned. Mel took a deep breath. "Ready?" she asked, and only Jake nodded. Jake was the first one to walk in, Mel followed, and I walked in last. Like I said, I despised jump scares and cheap horror, and so I was expecting the worst as we got into the first dark room. After I crossed the step, the door behind me automatically closed again. For a second, I couldn't see a thing, but slowly multiple candles all around the room lit up and parts of the room came into focus. We were standing in something that resembled a living room. In the middle of the room, a candle was placed on a small table. Behind it was a sofa that had sunflowers printed all over it. Another candle was hanging next to an old cuckoo clock that showed the wrong time. I scanned the entire room for eyes or movement, any sign of another person, but there didn't seem to be anyone. I tried to get out my phone for some light, but realized that I had left it in the car. I also didn't ask my friends because I knew they loved these places and they wanted the real thing. Jake walked up to the table and sat down by the sofa, making himself at home. "There's a letter on here," he said. I was wondering what they meant by following the signs. "Maybe there's something on there." Mel sat down next to Jake. "Is this an escape room? I thought it was a haunted house." I mumbled. "Maybe it's both." Jake started reading out loud what was written on the paper. "Welcome home. At least for one. Do everything right, and 3 might leave." What the hell? What's that supposed to mean? He asked after he was done. "How do they know there's 3 of us?" "There's probably cameras outside," Jake whispered. "That's kinda cool. But what do we do next?" Mel asked. "Does it have any other instructions?" She grabbed the letter from Jake's hands and turned it around. "Rob, come here." She scooched over and made some space for me on the sofa. Then she started reading the backside of the letter. "You are guests, for now. Act as such. Afterward, move on to the next room." "Okay, weird. Should we just move on to the next room?" "This one is kinda boring," Jake said. Mel shrugged. "If you can find the door." Jake got up and grabbed the candle that was hanging next to the clock. Before he removed it, I noticed that the time on it had changed by 2 hours. "There it is," he said from the corner of the room. "Come on, guys." Mel stayed frozen, and so did I. I preferred Jake taking a look first, just in case there was a jump scare waiting. Guests don't open the door. An unfamiliar male voice spoke, and I saw Jake slowly walking backwards. A young man came through the door. He didn't appear much older than us and resembled a farmer with his denim pants and lumberjack shirt. The weird part was that there was nothing particularly scary about him. Normally the actors in these places have all sorts of bloody makeup or masks, and they carry real-looking weapons. This was just a regular guy, but there was still something uncanny about him. As he walked up towards where we were sitting, I noticed that he was holding a tray with teacups on it. There were 2 in total. "Have a drink," he said, his eyes focused on Mel. Then his hand started shaking so much that the tray almost fell, but Mel had grabbed it just before it could. She took one of the cups and gave the other to me. The cup was empty. Mel giggled awkwardly and clinked her cup with mine. "Cheers," she whispered. The strange guy just stood there, watching us the entire time. All you could hear was his deep breathing. "Okay, now I'm starting to get creeped out," Jake said. "May we continue now?" He jokingly asked the stranger, who was still only looking at us. He slowly nodded, and so we got up and walked towards Jake. I turned around one more time and met the eyes of the stranger. I saw the fear in them as he whispered, "Please, save me." The door closed behind us, and again, we found ourselves in darkness. "That was creepy," I said. "Well, it's supposed to. It's a haunted house," Mel laughed. "No, I agree." "This is weird," Jake said. "That guy didn't even look scary, and he still creeped me out." Suddenly, the lights turned on. This time there weren't any candles, but a big, fluorescent light on the ceiling. We were in the kitchen. The white tiles on the floor were dirty and sticky. In front of us was a kitchen island. Behind it were the typical things such as an oven, sink, and fridge. This time the letter was glued to the fridge. Mel and I simultaneously walked up to it, but before I could start reading it, another door opened. A woman with dark hair walked inside. She was wearing an apron and a white mask with holes in her mouth and eyes. She came closer and slowly tilted her head. First, she stared at me and Mel, then her gaze moved to Jake. Mel grabbed my arm, this time not because she was trying to comfort me. I think she was starting to get freaked out. The woman with the mask stayed silent the entire time, and after a while, she started slowly shaking her head. Hello, miss. Can we move to the next room?" Jake carefully asked. The woman pointed towards the note on the fridge, which I'd almost forgotten. Mel grabbed it and started reading, her voice breaking in between. "A meal is waiting right inside. Take a bite and you will stay. Take 9 and you will be cut." I opened the fridge and dozens of fruit flies started flying out of it. I almost threw up at the sight of what was in there. On top of a big plate there I saw a rotten ham with maggots crawling all over it. The woman suddenly appeared behind me and pushed forward. She took the plate with the ham outside, and maggots started crawling up her arm. Then she placed it on the kitchen island and got a knife out of a drawer as well as 3 plates. This was some next level shit. I'd never seen real insects in one of these houses. She started slicing up the ham and I felt even more sick. "There's no way in hell I'm eating that," Mel exclaimed. "It's gotta be fake, right?" Jake came closer. The woman with the mask cut up the first slice, put it on a plate, and tried handing it to me. No, thank you," I mumbled. "Well, it says to eat the meal or get cut," Jake laughed. "Yeah, fuck that dash." Before I could finish, the woman grabbed my arm and slid the knife along my lower arm. Blood started dropping from my sleeve. "What the actual dash?" This was real blood. I felt real pain. This couldn't be right. We never consented to any of that. I pulled my arm away and tried to grab the knife from the crazy woman. Jake ran over to help me when suddenly the door opened and a couple of new people walked inside. None of them were wearing masks, but all of them looked somehow messed up. Suddenly arms grabbed me from all sides, and before I knew what was happening, I was pushed through the door into a new room. I fell to my knees as the door closed shut and I sat in darkness. Jake? Mel? I shouted, but there was no answer. I couldn't see anything. My body was frozen. A few moments later, the door opened. I got back to my feet and caught a glimpse of my friends. Before I could act, the door was closed again. Rob? I heard Mel's voice as a hand grabbed mine and guided me through the darkness. All around me, I started hearing voices. Please, let me out. Save us. Take me with you. Arms were trying to grab me from all sides, but I kept fighting through. Finally, a door opened. As we passed the final door, I could see nothing in front of me, but I felt the cold of the night hitting my face and knew that we made it outside. I couldn't speak yet. My mind couldn't yet comprehend what had happened. We made it, Rob, let's go. I heard Mel behind me. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the dark and I realized that we were in front of the haunted house again. We'd come out of the front door, which was impossible. The room we just left wasn't the entry we'd come in through, but the car was just in front of us. I unlocked it as I ran towards the driver's seat. I heard the steps of my friends quickly following. The door behind me opened and they jumped in. Let's go. Mel shouted and I hit the gas. My breathing was still heavy, but slowly relief washed over me. Until I took a look at the rearview mirror. First, I saw Mel. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she was looking down, gently stroking the dark hair of a person lying on her lap. I came to a full stop. Mel? I whispered. Who's that on your lap? The person slowly lifted their body. When our eyes met, I couldn't believe myself. Susie? Her eyes were bloodshot. Her face had lost all color. She was dressed in an old skirt and a shirt, as well as an apron. She was the woman in the kitchen. I'm so sorry, Rob. It was the only way to get her out, Mel cried. What was? Where's Jake? They didn't answer. Shit, we need to turn around, I said, but I didn't dare to move. There's no way to get him out, Susie whispered. Harry will take him home. She didn't elaborate on that further. Is this a fucking joke? I'll call the police right now. Mel leaned over and put a hand on my shoulder. You can try. That's what I did last year. But it won't help. How? I don't understand. Mel, if this is some fucking prank, I swear dashed up. It's not. I don't understand it completely either. Mel looked at her sister. We went in last year with one of Susie's friends. He was the one who brought us the teacups in the beginning. Anyway, in the end, they cut me and I was outside. Susie and her friend didn't follow. I thought they were messing with me at first. But the next day, the house was gone and so were they. And then I received a letter. I grabbed the wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. What kind of letter? It had instructions. I'm sorry, Rob, but it said to bring 2 souls who mean the most to me. It said I could exchange them and get my sister and her friend back. But why am I outside then? I asked. I promised you, you'd be okay. I just needed Susie. Why I stay away from haunted houses. I still remember how the screen doors slammed that October evening. My foster father's voice, however, was even louder as he shouted after me, "Just where the hell do you boys think you're going?" I gestured over my shoulder at my friend Brett's car, idling at the end of the gravel driveway. I was going to a haunted house with some friends from school, I explained over the rumble of the motor. "Over my dead body," Frank yelled. "Get back up here." I couldn't understand what I'd done to make Frank Liddell so angry. He and my foster mom, Pam, were a little rough around the edges, but they weren't the exploiters or religious nut jobs that I'd feared when I was first put into foster care. They'd been nothing but kind to me so far, although the look on my foster father's face suggested that was all about to change. I wasn't scared of Frank Liddell, but I was afraid of what might happen if my new family rejected me. Giving up a haunted house seemed like a small price to pay to avoid the other kind of foster home. I shook my head at Brett. He rolled his eyes and drove off in a cloud of exhaust fumes, taking my hopes of fitting in at my new school with him. From now on, I'd be known as the loser who didn't celebrate Halloween. I dragged my feet on the way back to the porch, but all my irritation disappeared when I saw my foster father up close. He'd fallen, rather than sat, on the rocking chair beside the door. He was watching me with the shell-shocked pale expression of a man who just narrowly avoided a gruesome accident. "You ever been to one of those things before?" he asked. "A haunted house, I mean?" I shook my head. That was part of the reason why I was so eager to go. They got all kinds now. Ones with mechanical monsters. Ones where people in masks can jump out and grab you. At some of them, you gotta sign a waiver saying they're not responsible for whatever they do to you. You sure you want to go to a place like that? I hadn't thought about it, but I doubted that the local spooky attractions in the small town where the Liddells lived were known for over-the-top horror. The bright orange flyer I'd found had said that the place was kid-friendly. Frank rambled on. "Of course, most places just put out those warnings for show. If they ever really did hurt anybody, they'd be out of business overnight, provided that they were ever really in business to begin with. I mean, you never really know for sure who those masked figures are, do you? The ones who you've permitted to come out of the dark, touch you, maybe even drag you off someplace sure. It might just be an underpaid actor in a plastic costume. But can you be sure? I'd heard rumors like that before, campfire stories about serial killers in costumes who snuck into Halloween attractions to hunt their victims. I'd never paid them much attention, but the look on Frank's face made me reconsider. I'm not just talking about a couple of psychopaths here. What I want you to think about is this: why do haunted houses exist? I shrugged. I didn't know where this bizarre conversation was going, and at this point, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But Frank wasn't done. Don't think I can't see the appeal. Of course, getting scared is sort of fun if afterward you walk back out into the same, ordinary world you left behind. But what if you don't? What if it's the houses that want people to go inside and not the other way around? I took a deep breath. So my foster fathers thought that buildings could have personalities. There were worse kinds of crazy to be, I reminded myself, and looked wistfully down the country road where the fumes of Brett's car still lingered. This was my life now, and I'd have to make the best of it. I muttered an apology and moved toward the door, telling myself that I should count my blessings, but Frank's hand wrapped around my wrist like a claw. "Look, I'm willing to bet that nothing would have happened if you boys had gone to the haunted house in town tonight. People visit haunted houses all the time, right? Nothing happens to them, well, most of them. But if it did, would anyone notice the pattern? Think about it. If a cop or university professor suggested researching haunted house disappearances, they'd be laughed out of a job. So people look away, and it keeps happening. Frank drank a swig of water like a man throwing back a shot, and for the first time, I wondered whether the water that he always carried with him was a substitute for a different sort of bottle. Halloween wasn't always the big flashy holiday that it is today. When I was your age, we had a few hay bales and pumpkins in front of the town hall, some cardboard witches in the windows of the elementary school, and that was about it. If you wanted something fancy, like a rubber mask or a costume party, you had to go to the big city. Frank sighed. I shouldn't have yelled at you. But when I saw your buddy pull up in his car, I thought back to the Halloween night when my two best friends and I took that drive and went to our first haunted house. Cassie and Tyler didn't have many friends. I didn't either. That might have been the only thing the three of us had in common, but it was enough. See, Cassie's dad never did anything but drink and cause trouble, and most folks figured that the apple didn't fall from the tree. Tyler, on the other hand, Frank blushed. Well, the only thing people had against him was that the color of his mama's skin was different from his daddy's. The two of them had been dating for years, which is about as serious as it gets in high school, when they adopted me into the little group. I don't know why. Hell, maybe they were just bored. Either way, with Tyler and Cassie, I finally started doing the sort of things I'd always imagined teenagers did: smoking in the park, walking down railroad tracks, swimming in the river in summer, and having plans for Halloween night. That's the worst part, the part that still stings. The haunted house was my idea. We had it all planned out. Tyler's mom was the editor of some magazine, and a grateful author had sent her some expensive liquor as a thank you gift. Tyler would steal the bottle and give it to Cassie, who would leave it out for her dad after school. By 6 p.m. he'd be blackout drunk, and Cassie would snatch his keys and pick us up on the way out of town. We'd go to the city, where we'd trick-or-treat like little kids, visit a haunted house, try to sneak into some college parties. With the full moon rising and that fall wind in our hair, it felt like anything could happen. We had it all planned out. Frank repeated and shook his head. After buying some silly discount masks and gorging ourselves on candy bars from the rich neighborhoods, we headed for the haunted house. We hadn't kept track of time, and Cassie was afraid we wouldn't get there before close, not to mention the line. None of us were used to the city, and just finding a place to park among all those cars was a nightmare. It felt like the house, with its creepy lighting effects and soundtrack of evil laughter, was teasing us. Cassie left the car in front of a fire hydrant, and we took off down the sidewalk, hoping we weren't too late. The ticket guy was a kid our age in zombie face paint and an oversized pinstripe purple suit. He told us that the house closed at half an hour before midnight, and we were 3 minutes too late. All he wanted to do was finish cleaning up and go home, but I guess the look on our faces made him change his mind. He sighed, took our money, and pulled back the red velvet rope in front of the front porch stairs. The place had probably been some rich farmer's estate once. Now it was gray, gaunt, and rickety. There was something hungry about the way it loomed over us as we walked inside. The double doors creaked open automatically, a nice touch, I thought, and we stepped into a hallway lit only by creepy blue bulbs. Tyler made a joke about what shows up in blacklight. We all jumped a little and laughed when the doors slammed shut behind us. It must have been a pretty fancy house in its day, but the hallway Tyler, Cassie, and I walked down was bare except for plastic skeletons and fake cobwebs. It had a sad, barren look to it, like whoever had set up the haunted house didn't have the budget to decorate it the way that it deserved. Halloween-themed songs played from a speaker somewhere, and candles flickered in a couple of jack-o'-lanterns, but that was about it. The three of us were pretty disappointed. We'd expected movie quality effects, not cheap junk that we could have bought at the dollar store back in town. We'd almost reached the staircase at the far end of the hallway when a laughing woman with a rope around her neck fell from the ceiling. The rope brought her to a halt just above our heads, and we all screamed. Up close, it was clear that we were just looking at a mannequin dressed up like a witch, but that wasn't what had startled me. See, I would have sworn that what I saw was Cassie, eyeless and bone-thin like she'd been falling so long she'd starved to death. Tyler gave the mannequin a shove and chuckled as it swung on its rope. Cassie shushed him. It didn't seem right, disturbing the silence like that. The echoes were all distorted, like the hallway was somehow bigger than it looked. I put my foot on the first step of the staircase and everything went black. Suddenly I was falling, not down these steps, but different ones, stairs so steep I could feel the wind around me as I tumbled through the dark. When I looked up, Cassie had caught me. There were no twisted stairs here, just the dim lobby of a cheap haunted house. I told the other two that I'd race them to the second floor. We were panting by the time we got to the top, even though it couldn't have taken that long. The theme up there was classic monsters, a mummy that popped out of a broom closet, rubber bats bouncing from the ceiling, and a mechanical zombie that sat up from its coffin as we passed by. Nothing scary enough to even make us look twice, nothing like what had happened to me on those stairs. An arrow painted in fake blood directed us to a door on the left, and Tyler yanked the door open impatiently. We were bored already, eager to be done with this, and worried about the car, but what we saw behind that door stopped us in our tracks. It was just an ordinary living room. No decorations, no cheesy themes. Just a gramophone, some armchairs, a ticking wall clock in the shape of a cat with big eyes that swung from side to side. It was a near-perfect replica of how must have people lived almost a century ago, except that it looked brand new. There was even a cigar burning in an ashtray and a half-finished glass of brandy like whoever was living here would be back any minute. It felt obscene, like we were invading somebody's privacy and trespassing somewhere we shouldn't. I was about to suggest that we turn back when the door slammed and locked behind us. I knew we had to cross that eerie room to leave it, but even so, it was hard to take that first step. The tiny pink flowers on the hideous wallpaper seemed to squirm like tiny fingers, and I had an awful feeling that we were being watched from the far corner of the room. Suddenly, the gramophone started playing by itself, but the noise coming out of it wasn't music. It was us. Tyler, Cassie, and I, screaming, arguing, shouting in terror about bruises, and grabbing hands. We'd never spoken those words in our lives. The three of us looked at each other and all had the same thought: get out of here as quickly as possible. The gramophone kept getting louder and louder. I thought my ears would bleed before we got to the door on the other side of the room, but once we were through it, the noise stopped completely and all the lights went out. We closed the door behind us and leaned against it, too scared to talk. Tyler started to say something about how maybe it was all part of the act, but the words died in his throat, especially after he looked around at where we were. It was a dim, dirty kitchen. If the room we'd left had been something out of the last century, this one was all 1970s, dark wood cupboards, pea green walls, puke yellow linoleum. The only thing the two had in common was the inescapable, lingering feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, like something was leading us into its trap. Hunting us. Once, when I was a kid, the basketball I was playing with rolled under a neighbor's porch. I crawled in after it without thinking, and as I was feeling around in the dank, cobwebby dark, something growled behind me. I never found out what it was: a stray dog, a mountain lion, or maybe even just a rabid raccoon, but I never felt that kind of fear again until I stepped into that nasty little kitchen. Like I'd gotten myself trapped in a cramped place with something hungry and horrible. There were no windows and only one door. We had no choice but to keep going deeper into the house, if that's what it was. There was something wrong about the air in there. It seemed to be moving, and it wasn't until we approached the dripping faucet that I realized what it was. The air was buzzing with thousands of tiny flies. Cassie clamped a hand over her mouth and leaned over the sink to see where they were coming from. Then she groaned and bolted for the door. Tyler followed her, slipping in a puddle of something rust-colored and sticky that was coming from the fridge, and I followed. Our footsteps had woken the place up somehow. There was a bang from inside the cabinets, then another, so hard that they shook, and I realized that I absolutely could not handle seeing whatever was about to come out of there. We shoved each other through the door just in time, and felt the slam when something crashed into it behind us. More came, hard enough to rattle the door on its hinges, but it held. We were in what looked like a children's nursery. Bright, white smiling zoo animals are painted on the walls. Small bed topped with plain white sheets. A nightlight in the shape of a grinning plastic moon. It was dead silent, like the room was waiting for us. Then, all at once, four almost human shapes sat up beneath the covers. We froze, too scared to move. Then something reached out from beneath the bed and tried to pull me under. I yelped in pain, kicked it off, and ran. Once the door was pressed shut behind us, I rolled up the cuff of my jeans and found a burn mark in the shape of a tiny hand with too many fingers. It was still painfully cold to the touch. Cassie started yelling, demanding to be let out, shouting that we'd never agreed to let anyone touch us, but she stopped mid-sentence. It was the same argument that we'd heard on the gramophone when we first walked into this nightmare. The realization shocked us into silence, and we finally began to take in our surroundings. We were in another hallway, but this one didn't have an end. The ugly yellow wallpaper and old-fashioned doors went on forever in both directions. Just looking at it made me want to grab onto the floor, like at any minute the hallway would tilt and I'd slide down the carpet into the abyss. I was still trying to get my head around it when the doorknob of the room we'd left began to turn. There was rustling on the other side, fingers feeling around the gaps and hinges. Tyler started pulling on one doorknob after another, but they were all locked. At the pace he was moving, we struggled to keep up with him. He started knocking instead, swearing that he could hear movement and voices on the other side of the doors. He yelled and pleaded, begging to be let in. Then, when Cassie and I were too far away to help him, he got his wish. The door in front of Tyler swung open, and I saw the terror on his face for just a split second before he was sucked inside. The door shut and locked itself behind him, but Cassie and I weren't going to let that stop us. I kicked the door until my foot went through it, and then I howled in pain. There was nothing but a wall on the other side. It was like the house had swallowed Tyler up. Even worse, we had no idea where we were. The doors were all identical, and none of us had thought to mark the point that we'd started from. Cassie just shut down, holding her head in her hands and muttering about how this couldn't be happening. I remember thinking that at this rate, it wouldn't be long before both of us went crazy, and maybe that was the point. Then I heard hinges creaking. By the time I spun around, the door was wide open. There was nothing but darkness on the other side, at least that's what I thought at first. Once I got closer, though, I saw the stairs. Narrow, uneven, with a plunge into the blackness on either side, and no guardrail. Did I ever mention that I'm scared of heights? I couldn't do it. I told Cassie that I'd starve to death in the endless hallway before I'd make myself climb down there, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. Through a mix of pleading, insults, and holding my hand, she finally got me moving, even though I had to crawl backward to do it. Those steep, jagged stairs were made of something slick and cold as ice. A black wind blew around us as we crawled downwards. It felt like being on the edge of a mountain peak, even though I knew that was impossible. We were still indoors, weren't we? Or maybe, on the other hand, we hadn't been in that cheap haunted house for a long time. Just maybe, we'd been swallowed by someplace else. Before long, the stairs were so tall and narrow that it was almost like being on a ladder above space. I was so tense that I started shaking, and I guess it's no surprise that I slipped. I slid downward, unable to grip the narrow steps and knowing that at any second I might fall into nothingness on either side, but Cassie caught me. It happened exactly as I'd envisioned it earlier that night, just like the yelling that we'd heard on the gramophone. So what about the mannequin, the one that had looked like Cassie, long dead and falling through space? Clinging to the almost vertical steps, I shouted my friend's name, even though I knew that it was already too late. By grabbing me, she'd unbalanced herself and gone over the edge. She probably didn't even have time to scream. Cassie had been so sure that the stairs were our way out, but what if they had been a trap all along? After all, we hadn't opened the door to the darkness, the house had. I climbed back up the stairs as quickly as I dared and found the hallway above exactly as I'd left it. Well, not exactly. There was an end to it on either side, and there were sounds, cars driving by outside, the hum of a heating system, and the teenager who'd taken our tickets, yelling about how I wasn't supposed to be back there, and anyway, the haunted house was closed. Of course, I filed a police report, a lot of good that did. When I told them what had happened, they decided my friends and I were junkies on a bad trip. Later, they kicked around the idea that we were in some kind of satanic cult and that I killed them myself. In the end, I guess they just decided that the whole thing was too complicated and strange to bother with. Tyler's family moved away without a word to anyone, and Cassie's dad drank himself to death before Christmas. The neighbors said that at night he would scream out her name, like he didn't know she was gone. I stayed where I was and did my best to forget about the whole thing. As you can see, it hasn't worked out. The sun had set while Frank had told me his story, and in the twilight gloom, he looked almost like a ghost himself. I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something about how it was getting cold on the porch and headed for the screen door. "I'm not asking you to believe everything you hear," Frank smiled. "Just promise me that, as long as you live under my roof, you'll stay away from haunted houses." I nodded, and Frank pulled himself up from his rocking chair to follow me inside for supper. That's when I noticed the scar on his ankle, a scar in the shape of a small, six-fingered hand.